General William Westmoreland studied the map of South Vietnam's provinces and delivered his operational guidance to the Australian commander with characteristic brevity. Take over Phuoc Tuy. 3 words that assigned responsibility for an entire province to a force that numbered fewer than 5,000 soldiers. American officers reviewing the arrangement filed assessments expressing concern about the viability of the mission. The province stretched across nearly 2,000 square kilometers of terrain that Pentagon analysts described as ideal for guerrilla warfare. Viet Cong forces numbering approximately 5,000 controlled the countryside through an extensive political infrastructure reaching into every village and hamlet. Roads remained impassable without heavy escort. Government authority extended only to the provincial capital. The Australian Task Force commander received minimal operational direction beyond Westmoreland's terse instruction. No detailed plans? No specific objectives beyond the implied mission of establishing control where none existed. American predictions ranged from skeptical to dire. 5 years later, when Australian forces withdrew from Phuoc Tuy Province, the statistics they compiled told a story that defied those initial assessments, while simultaneously confirming the most pessimistic strategic evaluations about what military excellence could achieve without political foundation. The decision to assign Phuoc Tuy Province to Australian forces originated not in Saigon, but in Canberra, where Lieutenant General Sir John Gordon Noel Wilton confronted challenges that extended beyond simple military logistics. As Chief of the General Staff from January 1963, Wilton oversaw an army experiencing its largest peacetime expansion since the Second World War, while managing deployments to both Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation and Vietnam as American involvement escalated. The 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had deployed to Vietnam in June 1965 as the 3rd Infantry Battalion of the United States 173rd Airborne Brigade, operating in Bien Hoa Province under American command. The arrangement exposed fundamental differences in how Australian and American forces approached combat operations in Southeast Asia. American units conducted large-scale search and destroy operations designed to locate enemy concentrations, fix them in place through aggressive contact, and annihilate them through overwhelming firepower delivered by artillery batteries, tactical air support, and heavy bombers flying missions from bases in Thailand and Guam. Multi-battalion sweeps moved through suspected enemy areas, supported by extensive artillery preparation that pulverized terrain before infantry advanced. With success measured through body counts that were meticulously tallied and reported up chains of command after each operation, the underlying strategic assumption held that sufficient enemy casualties would eventually force North Vietnam to abandon its objectives in the south and accept a negotiated settlement preserving an independent non-communist South Vietnamese state. Wilton observed this approach with skepticism, informed by different operational experience. He had served with distinction during the Second World War in the Middle East and New Guinea, commanded field artillery during the Syrian campaign in 1941, and understood from that experience what happened when strategy relied primarily on inflicting casualties rather than achieving political objectives. Though historians would later describe his tendency to almost worship General Westmoreland, Wilton rejected the operational methods that characterized American combat operations throughout South Vietnam. He wanted Australian forces to avoid what he termed operations that became a bit of a meat grinder with tremendous casualties. The contradiction between admiring the American commander while rejecting his entire strategic approach reflected the complexity of alliance relationships during the war, where political necessity required cooperation even as professional judgment demanded independence. The Australian government's announcement on March 8, 1966, that 1 RAR would be replaced by a 2-battalion task force with armor, aviation, engineers, and artillery support created the opportunity Wilton sought. The expansion from a single battalion attached to American forces to an independent task force of roughly 4,500 men, with total Australian strength in Vietnam planned to rise to 6,300 when naval and air force elements were included, allowed for operational independence that attachment to a United States division could never provide. During a visit to Vietnam in March 1966, Wilton selected Phuoc Tuy Province as the location for Australian operations and approved Nui Dat in the Eid, center of the province, as the site for the task force base. Negotiations between Wilton and Westmoreland ensured that the 1st Australian Task Force would function as an independent command under the operational control of United States 2nd Field Force, Vietnam. A Corps-level headquarters in Bien Hoa that reported directly to Commander Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. This arrangement allowed the force greater freedom of action and the chance to demonstrate the Australian Army's evolving concept for counterinsurgency warfare, developed in part from operations during the Malayan Emergency that had lasted from 1948 to 1960. Phuoc Tuy Province met several criteria that made it suitable for independent Australian operations in spite of the challenges it presented. Located roughly 40 kilometers southeast of Saigon, the southernmost province in 3rd Corps Tactical Zone occupied territory dominated by the approaches to Vung Tau and the main highway to Aus, the capital. The province lay on the coast between the mountains of southern central Vietnam and the alluvial plains of the Mekong Delta, bisected by Route 2 running north to the provincial capital of Ba Ria, while Route 15 ran northwest, linking Vung Tau to Saigon as the main supply route for movement of stores landed at the port. Vung Tau contained a shallow water port of strategic importance due to its capacity to relieve congestion on the Saigon River, making control of the highway essential for Allied logistics throughout the region. The province was an area of significant Viet Cong activity that required attention. Was located away from the Cambodian border, which reduced concerns about North Vietnamese army infiltration directly from sanctuaries, could be resupplied and, if necessary, evacuated by sea through Vung Tau, and was suitable in size for task force operations without being so large that 2 or 3 battalions could not maintain effective presence. Most importantly, for Australian political considerations, concentrating forces in a single defined area would achieve greater national recognition than dispersing units throughout 3rd Corps as minor attachments to American formations. By 1966, when Australian forces prepared to move into Phuoc Tuy Province, the area was controlled by the Viet Cong, with an effectiveness that made American skepticism about Australian prospects entirely rational. South Vietnamese government authority over Phuoc Tuy was limited almost entirely to the provincial capital Ba Ria. In the countryside, the Viet Cong had built up an extensive cadre and political organization that reached into every town and village through a parallel administrative structure. The province was divided administratively into 5 districts: Long Lay, Long Dien, Dat Do, Duc Tan, and Suyen Moc, each with a district chief appointed by the central government. But effective control rested with the Ba Long Province People's Committee that coordinated Viet Cong activity under the direction of the Central Office for South Vietnam, an organization controlled by North Vietnam. The Viet Cong infrastructure provided support through cells and committees extending into villages and hamlets, collecting taxes, conscripting labor and recruits, and subjecting the population to coercion that ranged from political education to targeted assassination of government officials and their families. The province's roads were dangerous, subject to ambush, and passable only with heavy escort. The Viet Cong had established bases in Phuoc Tuy's mountains and jungles, where military forces operated with confidence born from years of controlling terrain that Army of the Republic of Vietnam units rarely contested. Military estimates placed the number of communist troops in the province at 5,000. a force structure built around two main force regiments and supporting local units. The 274th Viet Cong Regiment, known also as the Dong Nai Regiment, was based in the Hot Ditch Secret Zone in northwestern Phuoc Tuy, with 3 battalions designated D-800, D-265, and D-308, numbering between 1,200 and 2,000 men, recruited from outside the area of their operation, and supplemented by North Vietnamese Army regulars. The regiment was equipped with 82mm mortars, 12.7mm heavy machine guns, and 75mm recoilless rifles operated by supporting companies that provided fire support beyond the capability of the rifle battalions. The 275th Regiment was based in the Mae Tao Mountains and mainly operated in the east of the province, commanded by Senior Captain Nguyen Thoi Bung, and consisting of 3 battalions designated H-421, H-422, and H-423, with a total of 1,800 men. Supporting both regiments were artillery, engineer, signals, and sapper, reconnaissance battalions, along with medical and logistic units, all organized under the 5th Viet Cong Division that had been formed in early September 1965 by Central Office for South Vietnam to command main force operations across Long Con, Binh Thuy, and Phuoc Tuy provinces. The D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion represented local force capability that proved as formidable as the main force regiments in spite of its smaller size and more limited equipment. Formed on May 19, 1965, the battalion consisted of 3 rifle companies and 1 weapons company with a total strength of 350 men, recruited principally from Dat Do, Long Dien, and Hoa Long districts. The battalion operated throughout the Dong Nai River Basin and Bien Hoa, Phuoc Tuy, and Long Con provinces, demonstrating a capacity to engage both American and later Australian forces in sustained combat, even after suffering casualties that would have destroyed less resilient units. Local force companies including C-23, C-25, and C-41 provided additional capability at district level, while an estimated 400 local guerrillas lightly armed and operating in groups of 5 to 10 personnel maintained Viet Cong presence in villages where main force units rarely appeared. The military forces supported a political apparatus designed to control population through a combination of services, ideology, and violence carefully calibrated to maintain authority without generating resistance that might drive villagers toward the government. Against this entrenched presence came forces assembled with unusual haste and carrying confidence not entirely justified by preparation. The first Australian task force began arriving at Vung Tau between April and June 1966 under the command of Brigadier Oliver David Jackson, an officer who brought extensive combat experience from the Second World War and Korea, but limited understanding of counterinsurgency operations in Southeast Asian conditions. Born in London on November 24, 1919, Jackson had graduated from the Royal Military College, Dun Truon, in December 1939 and served in the Middle East and New Guinea during the war. Commanded infantry battalions in all 3 original battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment during the 1950s and early 1960s, and taken command of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam on February 5, 1965, before assuming command of Australian Army Force Vietnam later that year when he was promoted to brigadier. He possessed the distinction of being the only officer to command all 3 of the original battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment, a record that testified to professional competence, but also revealed the limited pool of officers with command experience from which the expanding Army drew its senior leadership. The task force initially consisted of 2 infantry battalions, the 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. with the 1st Battalion completing its attachment to American forces before returning to Australia. Supporting arms included the 1st Regiment, Royal Australian Artillery equipped with 105mm guns, the 1st Armoured Personnel Carrier Squadron operating M113, tracked vehicles, cavalry, and engineer squadrons, signals units including the classified 547 Signal Troop that conducted radio direction finding and signals intelligence, and 3 Squadron of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment that arrived at Vung Tau via Saigon on June 16, 1966. New Zealand contributed the 161st Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, which had been serving with the American 173rd Airborne Brigade and transferred to Australian Command in June 1966. The entire force numbered about 4,500 personnel, organized in a brigade-sized formation in spite of its designation as a task force, with a support group designated 1st Australian Logistical Support Group, established at the port of Vung Tau to handle supply and maintenance for forward operations. The largest Australian formation deployed since the Second World War had been hastily assembled and included many untried national servicemen serving alongside professional soldiers. Few of its senior personnel had direct experience of counterinsurgency operations, and even fewer possessed first-hand understanding of the situation in Vietnam. While the force had been unable to train together before departure, arriving in theater and commencing operations without the collective preparation that doctrine emphasized as essential for effective performance. The professional confidence that Australian officers brought from their experience in Malaya during the emergency and from training exercises in Northern Australia would be tested against realities that differed substantially from the conditions those earlier operations had presented. The site Wilton selected for the task force base created immediate challenges that revealed how theory and practice diverged when abstract planning met physical terrain occupied by hostile forces. Nui Dat, Vietnamese for Small Hill, occupied a location 8 kilometers north of Ba Ria on Route 2, 30 kilometers from the port of Vung Tau, where logistical support would be concentrated. The central position offered short lines of communication throughout the province and allowed the task force to disrupt Viet Cong activity across the entire area of operations. But the distance from supporting logistics created vulnerability during the establishment phase and would require extensive base defense that consumed manpower better employed in operations. More immediately problematic, the area around Nui Dat had been a well-known Viet Cong stronghold for years, and many residents in nearby villages had family members serving in Viet Cong units or supporting the insurgent infrastructure through various forms of cooperation, ranging from willing collaboration to coerced compliance. The villages nearest Nui Dat, Long Tan and Long Phuoc, were both considered Viet Cong strongholds where government authority had never extended effectively, and where the population maintained relationships with insurgent forces that ranged from sympathetic to familial. Brigadier Jackson, with the agreement of the province chief, who was an Army of the Republic of Vietnam officer appointed by the central government, decided that security requirements demanded the forcible resettlement of 3,000 people and their livestock from these villages to areas where they could be monitored more effectively by South Vietnamese authorities. The removal of the local people from the vicinity meant that the chances of the Viet Cong gathering information about the base and the movement of Australian troops were significantly reduced. But attempts to win the support of Phuoc Tuy's people were compromised by the decision to remove people from their homes without compensation, creating resentment that would complicate pacification efforts throughout the Australian tenure in the province. From May 17th to June 15th, 1966, United States and Australian forces secured the area around Nui Dat during Operation Hardihood, deploying 2 battalions of the United States 173rd Airborne Brigade, along with elements of 1 RAR and 5 RAR, to to clear Viet Cong forces from within a security zone extending 4,000 meters in all directions from the planned base location. The clearance of the fortified village of Long Phuoc began on May 19th when the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, was deployed by helicopter to Nui Dat, while Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces moved into the village to conduct searches. Within the planned security zone, the inhabitants were relocated following heavy fighting between two companies from D445 Battalion and American Infantry that revealed the extent of Viet Cong defensive preparations. The enemy had constructed extensive tunnel and bunker systems throughout the area, with well-sited fighting positions that allowed small groups of defenders to delay much larger attacking forces, while inflicting casualties disproportionate to the numbers engaged. One company of the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry, lost 12 killed and 35 wounded during a single clash, while Viet Cong losses were reported as 16 killed. By May 24th, the clearance was complete with Viet Cong casualties estimated at 18 dead at Long Phuoc and 45 additional estimated killed, though accurate counts proved impossible because the enemy practiced systematic removal of dead and wounded from engagement areas during darkness, denying attackers the ability to confirm results and depriving intelligence officers of information about which units had been engaged. American casualties during Operation Hardihood totaled 23 killed and 160 wounded, losses that validated assessments about the danger of operating in territory the Viet Cong had controlled for years and had extensively prepared for defense. The Australians suffered their first casualties in the Nui Dat area on June 11th when 2 members of D Company were killed and 3 wounded when a patrol was hit by artillery fire on the southwestern side of the task force perimeter, demonstrating that Viet Cong forces possessed indirect fire capability and intelligence about Australian positions that allowed effective targeting in spite of the security operations that had supposedly cleared the area. The base was established by members of the United States 173rd Airborne, the 1st Battalion, and 5th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment on May 24, 1966, with Jackson flying in with his tactical headquarters on June 5th to take command as 1ATF occupied Nui Dat and began transforming a rubber plantation into a fortified position that even a divisional assault would find difficult to enter. The Viet Cong did not abandon the area without ensuring they understood Australian defensive arrangements. Each night, they began to creep up to Australian positions to determine where defensive wire was sited and how effective it was, waving lights about on poles in attempts to locate machine guns by drawing their fire. Though Australian soldiers maintained discipline and did not respond to provocations unless enemy forces came within very close range, and machine guns were under orders not to fire at all unless a heavy attack developed. This probing was normal procedure for the Viet Cong in preparing large-scale attacks and tended to confirm intelligence reports that the 274 Regiment was planning to attack the Australian position around June 12th in order to throw the task force out of Phuoc Tuy and restore their loss of face amongst the local people whose forced removal had demonstrated Viet Cong inability to protect villagers from foreign military power. In October 1966, Australians captured the diary of Nguyen Nam Hung, deputy commander of 274 Regiment, who had commanded the reconnaissance teams that probed Nui Dat during early June, providing confirmation from enemy sources about what Australian intelligence had assessed from observed behavior during the tense nights when soldiers waited in fighting positions expecting attack. The occupation of the Nui Dat area was completed without the major assault intelligence had predicted, and the task force base was rapidly built into a fortification whose defensive strength would be tested repeatedly over the coming years, but never successfully penetrated by enemy forces in spite of numerous attempts. What the establishment phase revealed was the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Australian mission in Phuoc Tuy Province. Security requirements demanded actions like forced resettlement, that undermined the political objective of winning popular support away from the Viet Cong. The villages had been cleared to protect the base, but clearing them damaged relationships with the population, whose loyalty both sides sought. The military logic was sound. The political cost was substantial. The tension between these imperatives would shape operations throughout the 5 years Australian forces occupied the province. With the base established and secured by early June, the task of actually controlling the province could begin. But control meant different things to different commanders, and the methods employed to achieve it reflected fundamental disagreements about how counterinsurgency warfare should be conducted. American strategy under Westmoreland rested on assumptions drawn from military experience in 2 world wars and Korea, where large conventional forces had achieved victory through superior firepower and industrial capacity applied systematically until enemy resistance collapsed. Search and destroy operations conducted by multi-battalion formations supported by massive artillery preparation and tactical airstrikes were designed to locate enemy concentrations, engage them decisively, and annihilate them through overwhelming violence that would eventually exhaust North Vietnamese will to continue the war. Success was measured through body counts, with detailed tallies of enemy dead reported up chains of command after each operation, based on the underlying assumption that sufficient casualties would force political concessions that would preserve South Vietnam as an independent non-communist state. The American approach generated massive firepower and impressive tactical results measured by enemy casualties, but achieved limited lasting impact in what became a frustrating pattern visible across South Vietnam by 1967. Operations would sweep through an area with battalions supported by artillery fires and tactical airstrikes, engage enemy forces in sharp firefights that inflicted casualties measured in hundreds, then withdraw to conduct operations elsewhere according to theater-wide plans that emphasized maintaining offensive momentum through constant pressure. The Viet Cong would avoid battle unless conditions favored them, dispersing before American forces arrived in strength and waiting for the inevitable withdrawal, before returning to areas they had temporarily abandoned during the sweep. Villages that appeared secure immediately after American operations would return to Viet Cong control within days or weeks of the departure of conventional forces whose mission required them to continue moving rather than remain in place to consolidate gains. By 1967, equipped with sophisticated weapons and unlimited firepower support from artillery, tactical air, and strategic bombers, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces initiated 90% of large firefights, according to studies analyzing combat patterns throughout the country, retaining strategic initiative that allowed them to choose when and where to engage American forces on terms that often favored insurgents who knew terrain intimately and enjoyed support or at minimum acquiescence from significant portions of the rural population. Australian battalion commanders viewed this approach with skepticism, born from different operational backgrounds and different conceptions of what counterinsurgency required. Their measures of effectiveness focused on denying enemy freedom of movement, separating the population from Viet Cong influence, and establishing sustainable security rather than maximizing enemy casualties through aggressive contact. Westmoreland reportedly complained to Major General Tim Vincent that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough according to American standards that equated aggressiveness with frequent large-scale operations generating high body counts. The Australian emphasis on patrolling, on searching villages without destroying them, on establishing ambushes and cordon operations designed to gather intelligence as much as inflict casualties, appeared insufficiently violent compared to American doctrine that celebrated offensive spirit and aggressive pursuit of the enemy regardless of cost. The doctrinal divide ran deeper than simple disagreement over tactics or preferred methods of conducting operations. It represented fundamentally different conceptions of what the war was about and how it could be won. American strategy assumed that inflicting sufficient casualties would break enemy will and force political concessions, applying industrial-age logic about attrition to a conflict where the enemy's strategic objective was not to win battles, but to survive long enough for American domestic support to erode. Australian thinking, informed by experience in Malaya during the emergency, held that counterinsurgency required patient application of pressure designed to separate insurgents from population support while establishing government control that could be sustained after foreign forces departed. The Malayan emergency had lasted 12 years and had been won not through spectacular battles, but through systematic operations that gradually denied the insurgents access to food, recruits, and intelligence from the population, combined with political reforms that addressed legitimate grievances and offered alternatives to supporting the insurgency. Whether those lessons applied to Vietnam, where the insurgency enjoyed external support from North Vietnam, and where the South Vietnamese government lacked legitimacy among significant portions of the population, would be tested in Phuoc Tuy Province over the coming years. The differences would be tested in a rubber plantation east of Nui Dat, where D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, would face the full weight of Viet Cong forces determined to demonstrate that the Australians could be defeated and driven from the province if sufficient force was concentrated against them. The battle that developed on August 18, 1966, would establish patterns that shaped operations for the remainder of the Australian presence, while revealing both the capabilities and the limitations of the force Brigadier Jackson commanded. The background to the battle began weeks before the actual contact, when a secret Australian Army Signals Intelligence Unit designated 547 Signal Troop began tracking radio transmissions from the Vietnamese 275 Viet Cong Regiment as it moved from its base area in the Mae Tao Mountains through terrain east of Nui Dat. For 16 days, the signals intelligence specialists monitored the regiment's movement, plotting its progress on maps and reporting their findings to a restricted audience that included Brigadier Jackson, the Task Force Operations Officer Major Dick Hannigan, and the intelligence officers on the Task Force headquarters staff. Information arising from signals intelligence was available to battalion commanders such as Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend, who commanded 6 RAR. But they could not be told the source, because security protocols demanded that the enemy not deduce their radio traffic was being monitored. The habitual secrecy meant that officers other than those of the Intelligence Corps had no experience in interpreting, evaluating, or even understanding the strengths and limitations of signals intelligence. And Jackson himself had not been exposed to this form of information before assuming command in Vietnam. His ability to use signals intelligence, as far as the specialists were concerned, was very limited, a judgment that would prove significant when decisions had to be made under pressure during the coming battle. On the night of August 16th to 17th, 1966, Viet Cong forces attacked Nui Dat from a position 2 kilometers to the east, using mortars and recoilless rifles to shell the base until counter-battery fire from Australian artillery forced them to cease firing and withdraw. The following morning, Jackson ordered D Company, 6th RAR, to depart Nui Dat to locate the firing positions and determine the direction of the Viet Cong withdrawal. A routine reconnaissance mission that appeared to involve minimal risk based on the assumption that the enemy mortar teams would have withdrawn far from the area by the time Australian infantry arrived. D Company numbered 108 men commanded by Major Harry Arthur Smith, a professional officer who had served in Korea and brought experience to the mission, but could not anticipate what signals intelligence suggested, that a large Viet Cong force was positioned in the area where his company would be patrolling. The company moved east from Nui Dat on the morning of August 18th, conducting a systematic search for evidence of the mortar positions, finding some equipment, and continuing the patrol into the afternoon, as heavy monsoon rain began falling that reduced visibility to a few meters turned the red earth of the rubber plantation into slick mud. Around 4 in the afternoon, 4 kilometers east of Nui Dat, near the abandoned village of Long Tan, the lead platoon made contact with Viet Cong forces and came under fire from what appeared initially to be a small enemy element. Within minutes, it became apparent that D Company had not encountered a small rear guard, but had walked into a force of extraordinary size. The 275 Regiment, with roughly 1,800 men, reinforced by D445 Battalion, with up to 350 men and possibly additional regular People's Army of Vietnam elements, had positioned themselves in the rubber plantation where Australian patrols regularly operated. The total enemy force probably numbered between 1,750 and 2,500 soldiers, well armed with AK-47 and SKS assault rifles, RPG-2 rocket-propelled grenades, light machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles. With each man issued 2 or 3 grenades and grenadiers carrying up to 10 or 12, along with reserves of small arms ammunition, mortar bombs, and rounds for crew-served weapons. Major Smith formed D Company into a defensive position and called for artillery support from the Australian and New Zealand guns at Nui Dat, directing fire through radio communications with the Fire Direction Center, while Viet Cong forces began launching human wave assaults designed to overrun the Australian position through sheer weight of numbers before artillery could break up the attacks. The 105mm guns of the Australian artillery and the 155mm guns of the New Zealand battery fired defensive concentrations dangerously close to D Company's perimeter, with some rounds landing within 50 meters of Australian positions. But the fire was effective in breaking up enemy assault waves that surged forward through the rubber trees in formations that presented massed targets for artillery airbursts. The company ammunition situation grew critical as soldiers fired thousands of rounds to repel successive attacks, with some soldiers down to their last magazines when the artillery kept assaulting forces at distance and prevented the close combat that would have exhausted Australian ammunition within minutes. Brigadier Jackson faced a decision complicated by intelligence he possessed, but could not fully evaluate. The signals intelligence indicated that while the 275 Regiment was engaged with D Company east of Nui Dat, the 274 Regiment was positioned northwest of the base in a location that suggested it might attack Nui Dat itself if Jackson weakened the base defense by sending a relief force to assist D Company. Concerned for the safety of the entire task force and uncertain about enemy intentions, Jackson initially hesitated to authorize dispatch of the relief force, though he eventually permitted Lieutenant Colonel Townsend to lead A Company, 6th RAR, mounted on M113 armored personnel carriers, toward D Company's position with additional ammunition and the firepower the armored vehicles provided through their machine guns. The relief force fought its way through light enemy contact to reach D Company just as the Viet Cong began withdrawing. Having suffered heavy casualties from the sustained artillery fire and unable to achieve the quick victory their assault tactics required, the battle ended as darkness fell, with Australian forces holding the ground where D Company had formed its defensive position and Viet Cong forces withdrawing into the jungle carrying their dead and wounded according to standard practice that denied enemies accurate casualty counts. The next morning, Australian soldiers counted 245 Viet Cong bodies on the battlefield, though the actual enemy casualties were certainly higher given the number of wounded who had been evacuated during the night and the dead who had been removed from areas Australian forces had not thoroughly searched. D Company and the relief force had suffered 18 killed and 24 wounded, losses that were significant but far less catastrophic than what American doctrine suggested should occur when a company-sized element encountered a force more than 10 times its size under conditions that prevented rapid reinforcement or extraction. The battle established Australian dominance in Phuoc Tuy Province, by demonstrating that even when the Viet Cong concentrated overwhelming force and achieved surprise, Australian firepower and tactical proficiency could defeat attacks that should have succeeded based on simple numerical calculations. The 275 Regiment withdrew to War Zone D for refitting and retraining. Having suffered casualties that would require months to replace, and having failed to achieve the psychological victory that destroying an Australian company would have represented. The immediate military impact was clear. The broader implications proved more complex. Australian forces had demonstrated capability under the worst possible circumstances, validating doctrine that emphasized artillery support and combined arms coordination even for small unit operations. But the battle also revealed problems with intelligence dissemination that would require attention. Jackson's limited ability to interpret and use signals intelligence had contributed to the delay in dispatching the relief force. Though his caution was defensible, given genuine concern that committing forces to rescue D Company might expose Nui Dat to attack by the 274 Regiment, whose location remained uncertain. The compartmentalization necessary to protect sources meant that commanders made decisions without full understanding of the intelligence picture, a problem that would persist throughout the war as security requirements conflicted with operational effectiveness. Post-battle assessments concluded that the 275 Regiment had been severely weakened, and that D445 Battalion, while still capable of operations, posed a diminished threat after the casualties it had sustained. The battle's reputation would grow over subsequent years until it became the most famous Australian engagement of the entire war. Commemorated annually and studied in military schools as an example of how properly trained infantry supported by responsive artillery could defeat numerically superior forces through superior tactics and firepower. What the battle could not accomplish was eliminating Viet Cong presence in Phuoc Tuy Province. The 274 Regiment remained active in the northwestern areas. Local force companies continued operating at district level, and the village infrastructure that provided the insurgency with intelligence, recruits, and supplies remained largely intact in spite of the military setback Viet Cong main force units had suffered. The months following Long Tan saw Australian forces developing operational patterns designed to extend control throughout the province through systematic application of pressure that emphasized intelligence gathering as much as enemy casualties. Cordon and search operations became a central feature of the campaign, with Australian battalions surrounding villages during darkness, then conducting thorough searches at first light, while South Vietnamese police screened inhabitants to identify Viet Cong infrastructure personnel and government supporters who had been coerced into cooperation through threats against their families. On October 30th, 1966, the task force cordoned Hoa Long village with 2 battalions, 5 RAR and 6 RAR, along with 3 Squadron of the Special Air Service Regiment and the 1st Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron, providing civil affairs, civic action, and psychological operations support for both civilians evacuated to the Province Interrogation Center at Ba Ria, and those permitted to remain in Hoa Long. Medical treatment and dental treatment were made available to anyone who required it, with the doctor and dentist attached to 2 RAR treating villagers throughout the day. Vietnamese entertainment films and music were provided, psychological leaflets distributed, and psychological operations audio broadcast aircraft and vehicles employed to communicate messages about government programs and the benefits of supporting Saigon rather than the insurgents. Apart from searching for Viet Cong in the villages, thorough searches were made among wood piles, earthen jars, ashes, gardens, and any other likely places where weapons, ammunition, documents, and other items of value to the Viet Cong might be hidden. The cordon and search operations represented an attempt to implement counterinsurgency doctrine that emphasized separating the population from insurgent control through a combination of security and services that would demonstrate government capability and win loyalty through performance rather than coercion. The reality proved more complicated than doctrine suggested. Villagers who cooperated with Australian forces during searches risked retaliation from Viet Cong infrastructure personnel who remained in place in spite of the operations, while those who refused to cooperate or actively assisted the Viet Cong faced consequences from South Vietnamese authorities whose methods of interrogation and detention did not always conform to the humanitarian standards Australian forces attempted to maintain. The civic action component of the operations generated some goodwill toward Australian soldiers who provided medical treatment and distributed supplies. But these short-term benefits did not translate into sustained support for the South Vietnamese government, which remained corrupt, ineffective, and distant from the concerns of rural villagers whose primary interest was survival rather than ideological commitment to either side. Operations against main force units continued as intelligence identified targets and opportunities for engagement. On February 17th to 18th, 1967, Australian forces from 6 RAR conducted Operation Bribey, responding to reports that a Viet Cong force had attacked a South Vietnamese regional force compound at Lang Phuoc High before withdrawing. 2 hours after the attack ended, a Viet Cong company was reported to have formed a tight perimeter in the rainforest 2 kilometers north of Lang Phuoc High, near the abandoned hamlet of Ap Mayan. Considering that the Viet Cong would attempt to withdraw as they had during previous encounters, forces from 1st Australian Task Force were inserted into blocking positions intended to intercept the withdrawal and destroy the enemy force through coordinated action. The operation resulted in the most intense fighting involving 1 ATF since Long Tan, with Australian casualties higher than in any engagement since August 1966. The results proved disappointing when measured against Australian losses, with fewer enemy bodies recovered compared to friendly casualties than in previous battles, and the task force unable to destroy D445 Battalion in spite of the heavy combat. The battle continued to be debated long after its conclusion, with some commanders arguing that 6 RAR had inflicted severe casualties on the Viet Cong that would have far-reaching effects on the insurgency in Phuoc Tuy Province, while others believed that any success had been marginal at best and that the cost exceeded the tactical gains achieved. Throughout March and April 1967, Australian forces conducted operations to open the highway to Xuyen Moc in the east, clearing Viet Cong forces from areas adjacent to the road and establishing security that would allow civilian traffic to move without constant threat of ambush. A series of operations aimed at destroying the Viet Cong. 274 Regiment were launched by 1 ATF during the second half of 1967, based on intelligence assessments that the 275 Regiment had been severely weakened following Long Tan and would require extended time for recovery. On August 6, 1967, a company, 7th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, conducted operations during Operation Ballarat in the Hat Dish area northwest of Nui Dat, when they clashed with a reinforced company from the Viet Cong 3rd Battalion, 274 Regiment, in a classic encounter battle between forces of roughly equal size. The engagement was fought at close quarters in dense jungle amid heavy monsoon rain that reduced visibility to a few meters, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as neither was able to gain decisive advantage through maneuver. Australian artillery again proved decisive, firing concentrations that forced the Viet Cong to withdraw after several hours of fighting, dragging many of their casualties with them as they broke contact and disappeared into the jungle that provided cover from Australian observation and fire. By the second half of 1967, the Viet Cong seemed to have melted away in Phuoc Tuy Province, abandoning many of their bunker systems and avoiding the main roads and towns where Australian patrols maintained constant presence. Brigadier Stuart Graham, who commanded the 1st Australian Task Force from October 1967 to October 1968, speculated that the Viet Cong might have fled to the border areas, perhaps leaving the province altogether under pressure from sustained Australian operations that denied them freedom of movement and inflicted casualties whenever they concentrated forces for offensive action. The assessment proved overly optimistic. The Viet Cong had not fled but had dispersed, avoiding battle while maintaining the infrastructure in villages that provided intelligence about Australian movements, collected food and supplies through taxation of the population, and recruited replacements for casualties suffered in earlier battles. The appearance of success masked the reality that military pressure alone could not eliminate an insurgency that drew strength from political organization embedded in the population. National elections, conducted by the South Vietnamese government in September 1966, had produced turnout figures exceeding 90% in Phuoc Tuy Province. Statistics that officials cited as evidence of growing government legitimacy and popular rejection of the Viet Cong. The reality was more complicated. High turnout reflected a combination of genuine participation by some villagers who hoped elections might bring improvements, coercion by South Vietnamese authorities who pressured villages to demonstrate loyalty through voting, and Viet Cong decisions to allow or even encourage voting in some areas where they calculated that the elections would fail to produce meaningful change and that preventing participation would generate reprisals against villages they sought to control. The elections demonstrated government capability to organize large-scale civic activities under reasonably secure conditions in areas where Australian military presence deterred Viet Cong interference. But they did not demonstrate genuine popular support for the Saigon regime, or confidence that the government would address the concerns of rural populations who had experienced decades of neglect and exploitation, by officials more interested in personal enrichment than public service. Military operations continued through 1967, with steadily increasing confidence that the province was coming under effective control, though intelligence assessments cautioned against complacency. Brigadier Graham initiated construction of a barrier minefield intended to seal off the Dat Du district from infiltration from the east, a project that would be described by journalist Dennis Warner as the greatest Australian mistake of the war after Viet Cong forces proved capable of penetrating the minefield regularly, stealing mines, and using them against Australian patrols with devastating effect. Roughly 30 Australian casualties resulted from the barrier minefield before it was finally abandoned. A reminder that innovative solutions to tactical problems could create new vulnerabilities when enemy adaptability exceeded the assumptions built into operational planning. The apparent success Australian forces achieved in dominating Phuoc Tuy Province during 1967 would be tested dramatically when North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated offensives throughout South Vietnam in late January 1968. The Tet Offensive saw Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces attack cities and military installations across the country in a coordinated campaign designed to spark general uprising against the Saigon government and demonstrate that Allied forces could not provide security, even in areas long considered under control. 1st Australian Task Force was deployed in response to the offensive, conducting Operation Coburg during January and February 1968, when it moved outside Phuoc Tuy Province to positions astride infiltration routes leading to Saigon, interdicting communist movement against the capital as part of the broader Allied response to the offensive that sought to prevent follow-on attacks after the initial assaults had been repulsed, with heavy enemy casualties throughout the urban areas where the offensive achieved surprise but failed to generate the popular uprising North Vietnamese planners had anticipated. In May and June 1968, Australian forces fought their largest and most sustained battle of the war, when 1 RAR and 3 RAR, with artillery and tank support, established fire support bases Coral and Balmoral in Bien Hoa Province, and came under attack from Regular People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong, main force units operating in battalion and regimental strength. The battles represented the first time Australian forces engaged in near-conventional warfare against pavan formations, employing tactics more reminiscent of Korean War battles than the small unit actions that had characterized most Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. The fire support bases were attacked repeatedly by enemy forces, attempting to overrun defensive positions through massed assaults supported by mortars and recoilless rifle fires, with Australian infantry, artillery, and Centurion tanks, which had been added to the task force in October 1967, combining to defeat attacks that came within meters of penetrating defensive perimeters before being driven back by sustained firepower that inflicted casualties the enemy could not sustain in spite of their numerical advantage. The battles demonstrated that Australian forces could conduct conventional defensive operations against regular enemy formations, but they also exposed the Australians to casualty rates higher than those experienced during counterinsurgency operations in Phuoc Tuy Province, validating concerns that employment outside the province in roles that differed from the counterinsurgency mission would result in losses that questioned the wisdom of the deployments. Brigadier Ron Hughes, who commanded 1ATF during the Coral-Balmoral battles, faced criticism in Australia for conducting what critics characterized as American-style operations that deviated from the counterinsurgency focus that had been presented as the rationale for independent Australian command of Phuoc Tuy Province. Lieutenant General John Wilton, serving as chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee with overall responsibility for Australian forces in Vietnam, strongly backed Hughes in spite of the domestic criticism, arguing that the deployment had been necessary to respond to the strategic threat the Tet Offensive represented, and that the task force commander's decision to accept missions outside Phuoc Tuy when directed by American Corps headquarters reflected the reality that Australian forces remained under operational control of United States 2nd Field Force Vietnam, and could not refuse assignments even when those assignments differed from preferred employment. The debate over proper employment of Australian forces would continue throughout the remainder of the war, with successive commanders torn between the counterinsurgency mission in Phuoc Tuy Province that allowed application of Australian doctrine and the demands from American higher headquarters for Australian participation in theater-wide operations that served broader strategic purposes but exposed the task force to risks that independent operations in a defined province were designed to avoid. While 1ATF fought outside Phuoc Tuy during the first half of 1968, the province itself experienced challenges to the security that Australian operations had established during the previous 2 years. Viet Cong forces maintained capability to conduct attacks in spite of the losses they had suffered, demonstrating that military pressure could force dispersal and make operations more difficult, but could not eliminate insurgent presence, while the political infrastructure in villages remained intact and capable of supporting renewed military activity when conditions permitted. Australian forces returned to the province after the Coral-Balmoral battles and resumed counterinsurgency operations, but the temporary deployment had revealed that even provinces under Allied control could not be held without constant military presence, and that gains achieved through sustained operations could evaporate quickly when forces were withdrawn or diverted to other missions. Strategic guidance from American commanders began shifting during 1969, as the administration of President Richard Nixon implemented policies designed to transfer responsibility for the war to South Vietnamese forces through a program designated Vietnamization. In May 1969, Lieutenant General Julian Ewell, who commanded United States 2nd Field Force Vietnam, directed that Australian forces reorient priorities to emphasize pacification first, upgrading Army of the Republic of Vietnam Forces second, and military operations against main force units third, reversing the previous emphasis on offensive operations designed to maximize enemy casualties. The directive reflected broader changes in American strategy as domestic opposition to the war grew, and political leadership sought exit strategies that would allow American withdrawal, while maintaining the fiction that South Vietnam could survive independently if properly trained and equipped by allies who would eventually depart. The shift to pacification as first priority created opportunities for Australian forces to apply counterinsurgency methods they believed more appropriate than the search and destroy emphasis that had characterized earlier American guidance. But it also exposed fundamental problems that military operations could not solve. An analysis of pacification progress in Phuoc Tuy Province, conducted by United States Colonel Robert M. Montague, Executive Officer for Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, in March 1969, concluded that Phuoc Tuy was probably the poorest run of all provinces he had visited throughout South Vietnam. Montague noted that all was not rosy in Phuoc Tuy, in spite of the presence of Australian forces and the resources devoted to security operations. Based on provincial resources available, the province leadership had not produced satisfactory results when measured against other provinces with similar or fewer assets. Though Phuoc Tuy ranked 6th out of 44 provinces in regional force strength, 7th in popular force strength, and 5th in national police strength, it ranked 42nd in Chiu Hoi returns. The number of Viet Cong who defected to the government under the Open Arms Program, and 36th in Viet Cong infrastructure neutralizations, the capture or killing of political cadre who maintained insurgent control in villages. The statistics revealed that numerical superiority in security forces meant nothing without effectiveness, leadership, and motivation to actually employ those forces against the enemy, rather than avoiding combat while collecting pay and engaging in corruption that enriched officials while alienating the population they supposedly served. Major Desmond C. Smith, Jr., the psychological operations advisor in Phuoc Tuy Province, had written in July 1968 that the Viet Cong still enjoyed complete freedom to move around the province in spite of adequate numbers of regional force and popular force troops that should have been sufficient to provide a company per village if properly deployed. Smith noted that one group of military within the province had the admiration and respect of all citizens, including Viet Cong infrastructure and Viet Cong or People's Army of Vietnam units, the Australians, but that this respect did not translate into support for the South Vietnamese government, whose forces were seen as ineffective, corrupt, and uninterested in the welfare of the population. Australian commanders were torn between different approaches to the pacification mission, with disagreements that revealed fundamental uncertainty about what the task force should prioritize given limited resources and the impossibility of simultaneously conducting operations against main force units in remote jungle bases, while also maintaining constant presence in villages where the population lived and where Viet Cong infrastructure operated. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Kahn, who commanded 5th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment during its second tour, lamented that his unit had been trained for totally the wrong war, arguing that pacification was a waste of time and that the proper role of 1 ATF was to hunt communist main force units in their remote jungle bases where they could be destroyed through aggressive operations. Lieutenant Colonel Keith O'Neill, who commanded 8th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment just months after Kahn departed, reached opposite conclusions, arguing that operations in deep jungle resulted in bunker contacts that created excessive Australian casualties for little permanent gain, while operations around villages where the population lived and where Viet Cong infrastructure could be targeted proved far more effective in achieving sustainable security. The debate was never resolved through doctrine or command guidance that definitively established priorities, and successive battalion commanders pursued operations that reflected their own assessments of what would prove most effective, given the resources they controlled and the conditions they encountered. The Australian Civil Affairs Unit, which had been raised in 1967 to coordinate civic action projects, expanded its activities during the pacification phase, providing medical treatment, educational support, and infrastructure improvements throughout the province. Liaison officers who spoke Vietnamese spent nights in villages developing relationships with local populations, delivering mail between Viet Cong prisoners held elsewhere in South Vietnam and their families in Phuoc Tuy, presenting briefings to former Viet Cong who had defected under the Chio Hoi program, and distributing compensation payments when Australian or South Vietnamese military operations caused damage to civilian property. The civic action programs built facilities, including schools and medical clinics, provided supplies and expertise, and demonstrated that foreign forces could contribute to village welfare. But these programs were often undertaken without reference to local populations until 1969, and maintenance and sustainment were responsibilities of the provincial government, which lacked capacity or will to provide ongoing support after Australian forces departed. In June 1969, 5th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment was involved in an engagement at the village of Bin Ba when Viet Cong forces occupied portions of the village, and Australian infantry supported by armored personnel carriers and tanks fought to clear them in house-to-house combat that left much of the village heavily damaged and requiring extensive reconstruction through civic action programs in the aftermath. The battle demonstrated that Viet Cong forces retained capability to conduct significant operations, even in areas where Australian presence was strong, and that military dominance did not translate into elimination of insurgent capability when political infrastructure remained intact, and population support or acquiescence could be maintained through combination of services and coercion that government forces could not match in spite of superior firepower. As the pacification phase continued through 1969 and into 1970, the limitations of what military operations could achieve without fundamental improvements in South Vietnamese government performance became increasingly apparent. The Viet Cong infrastructure in villages survived in spite of cordon and search operations, targeted raids, and civic action programs, because villagers calculated that cooperating with government forces might bring temporary benefits, but would result in long-term consequences when Australian forces eventually departed, and local Viet Cong returned to exact revenge on those who had collaborated with foreigners. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, forces that were supposed to assume responsibility for security as Australian involvement decreased, remained uneven in quality, according to assessments that attempted diplomatic language to describe forces that were often poorly led, inadequately motivated, and more interested in avoiding combat than engaging an enemy they had been fighting for more than a decade with no end visible. The broader strategic situation was forcing decisions that would render tactical debates about pacification versus main force operations increasingly irrelevant, as political pressures in both Australia and the United States demanded withdrawal of forces from a war that appeared unwinnable in spite of years of effort and thousands of casualties. In November 1970, 8th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment was not replaced at the end of its tour of duty, reducing 1st Australian Task Force from 3 infantry battalions to 2 as part of the gradual drawdown that reflected the Vietnamization policy and growing Australian government desired to reduce commitment to a war that domestic opposition had made politically unsustainable. The Australian area of operations remained unchanged, with the reduction in forces adding further to burdens on remaining battalions that were expected to maintain the same operational tempo with fewer personnel, while also preparing South Vietnamese forces to assume responsibilities they had proven incapable of managing effectively throughout the previous years. Enemy forces tested Australian resolve during the final period, with the 33rd Regiment of the People's Army of Vietnam conducting incursions into Phuoc Tuy Province during mid-1969 and again during 1971. reinforcing local Viet Cong units that had been weakened by years of sustained operations and attempting to challenge the security Australians had established through patient effort. In May 1971, Brigadier Bruce MacDonald, who commanded the task force during the final period, requested and received permission to extend the Australian area of operations 4 kilometers north into Long Con Province, where intelligence indicated that substantial Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam forces were concentrating in preparation for operations intended to disrupt the Australian withdrawal and inflict casualties that would provide propaganda value for North Vietnamese claims that they were driving foreign forces from South Vietnam through military pressure. Special Air Service Regiment reconnaissance patrols inserted into the vicinity of the Courtenay rubber plantation detected the presence of the substantial force intelligence had predicted, identifying positions and movement patterns that guided planning for Operation Overlord. Launched on June 5th as one of the last major Australian operations of the war. On June 6th and 7th, 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment attacked a heavily fortified communist base camp in Long Con Province, with Centurion tanks providing close support that crushed bunkers and their occupants through direct assault that conventional infantry could not achieve without prohibitive casualties. The Viet Cong fought hard to delay the Australian advance in spite of the overwhelming firepower the tanks provided, using the fortified positions they had carefully prepared to inflict casualties that demonstrated they retained capability to contest Australian operations even as withdrawal approached. 10 Australians were killed and 24 wounded during the battle, with a UH-1 Iroquois helicopter shot down during the fighting. While enemy casualties were difficult to assess because the bulk of the Viet Cong and PAVN force successfully withdrew intact, in spite of Australian efforts to fix them in place and destroy them through coordinated infantry and armor assault. The battle was one of the last major joint United States-Australian operations, conducted during a period when both nations were reducing forces and preparing for final withdrawal, that would transfer responsibility to South Vietnamese forces whose capability remained questionable in spite of years of advisory efforts and equipment provision. By mid-1971, Route 15 was open to unescorted traffic, a tangible measure of success that demonstrated Australian operations had achieved sufficient security to allow civilian movement without constant threat of ambush that had characterized the situation in 1966. When the task force first arrived, major population centers were relatively secure. Government officials could travel throughout much of the province without excessive security precautions, and the Viet Cong, main force units that had once operated freely throughout Phuoc Tuy, had been forced to withdraw to border areas or maintain such low profiles that their presence was detectable primarily through intelligence rather than through observable military activity. On August 18, 1971, Prime Minister William McMahon announced that the combat role which Australia had taken up over 6 years earlier in Vietnam was soon to be completed. The government had decided to withdraw all remaining Australian combat forces from Vietnam, with forces beginning withdrawal in the next few months to give the Vietnamese time to adjust their force dispositions. Most combat elements would be home in Australia by Christmas 1971, with shipment of stores and equipment to be completed in the early months of 1972. The announcement marked the formal end of Australian offensive operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. Though the physical withdrawal would require months of careful planning and execution to extract forces while maintaining security during the vulnerable period when reduced strength might invite attacks designed to inflict final casualties and claim victory over departing foreign forces. The Australian cabinet had made the decision to withdraw in July 1971, based on reports about the capacity of South Vietnamese regular forces to maintain security in Phuoc Tuy Province, and broader assessments that early decision to withdraw was inevitable, given political conditions in Australia where public support for continued involvement had eroded beyond recovery. the withdrawal proceeded on an accelerated timetable, with the first of the two remaining battalions departing in October 1971 and the second in December. HMAS Brisbane, a guided missile destroyer that had been providing naval gunfire support, departed in early September and was not replaced, reducing the fire support available for ground operations during the final months. On October 16, 1971, Australian forces handed over control of the base at Nui Dat to South Vietnamese forces in a ceremony that marked the formal end of 5 years of Australian occupation. Though significant Australian elements remained in country to complete the withdrawal of equipment and supplies. 4th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, the last Australian infantry battalion in South Vietnam, sailed for Australia aboard HMAS Sydney on December 9, 1971, ending the combat deployment that had begun when the task force first arrived at Vung Tau in April 1966. The company of the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment and the New Zealand Medical Team were withdrawn at the same time, concluding the Anzac partnership that had operated throughout the Australian tenure in Phuoc Tuy. D Company, 4th RAR, with assault pioneers, mortar sections, and a detachment of armored personnel carriers remained at Vung Tau to protect the task force headquarters and 1st Australian Logistical Support Group until final withdrawal of stores and equipment could be completed, finally returning to Australia on March 12, 1972. Australian Army Training Team Vietnam instructors remained in Phuoc Tuy Province until December 1972, continuing to advise South Vietnamese forces and attempting to prepare them for the responsibilities they would assume after all foreign combat forces departed, though assessments of South Vietnamese capability remained pessimistic. The Embassy Guard Platoon Saigon remained until July 1973, providing security for Australian diplomatic presence during the final period before complete withdrawal. Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam forces began moving back into Phuoc Tuy Province following Australian departure, re-establishing control over areas that had been contested for 5 years and demonstrating that temporary security achieved through foreign military presence could not be sustained by South Vietnamese forces, whose quality remained uneven in spite of years of training, and whose leadership remained poor in spite of advisory efforts that had consumed enormous resources. The province that Australian forces had dominated through professional military operations and sustained effort would return to communist control progressively as South Vietnamese government authority collapsed under pressure it could not withstand without the foreign support that was no longer available after American and Australian forces completed their withdrawals. Between June 1966 and December 1971, 1st Australian Task Force recorded at least 3,370 Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam killed, the majority in Phuoc Tuy Province, while an unknown number were wounded during operations that ranged from small unit patrol contacts to major battles involving multiple battalions with armor and artillery support. Total Australian Army casualties during the Vietnam War were 478 killed and 3,025 wounded, the bulk of which were sustained by 1 ATF during its 5 years operating in Phuoc Tuy Province. New Zealand casualties during the war were 37 killed and 187 wounded. The majority suffered while serving with Australian forces in integrated operations that reflected the Anzac partnership extending back through multiple conflicts over more than 50 years. The Special Air Service Regiment compiled statistics that stood apart from conventional force results and established standards that would influence special operations doctrine globally for decades after the war ended. 580 men served with the regiment in Vietnam across the 5-year deployment period, rotating through in squadron-sized elements that conducted continuous operations from June 1966 through October 1971. These soldiers conducted nearly 1,200 patrols, operating in small teams that penetrated deep into enemy-controlled territory to gather intelligence and conduct reconnaissance that guided employment of conventional infantry battalions throughout the province. In 298 contacts with Viet Cong forces, Australian SAS patrols accounted for 492 confirmed enemy killed, according to official records compiled from patrol reports, with an additional 106 listed as possibly killed when bodies could not be confirmed. 47 enemy soldiers documented as wounded, and 11 prisoners captured during operations and turned over to intelligence personnel for interrogation. Australian Special Air Service casualties during the deployment period totaled 1 soldier killed in action during contact with Viet Cong forces, 1 who died of wounds after being evacuated to Australia, where he succumbed to complications in spite of medical treatment, 3 killed in accidents during operations, 1 who went missing in action during 1969 after falling from a rope extraction system into jungle below, with his remains not recovered until August 2008, when they were finally located and identified, nearly 4 decades after his death, and 1 soldier who died of illness during the deployment period. 28 men were wounded in action, seriously enough to require medical treatment. Though these injuries proved survivable with rapid helicopter evacuation that delivered even seriously wounded soldiers to fully equipped surgical facilities within 30 or 40 minutes of injury. The kill ratio exceeded 30-1, representing performance that defied explanation based on probability calculations and combat experience from other reconnaissance units operating throughout South Vietnam, where American long-range reconnaissance patrol teams suffered casualty rates that made their missions among the most dangerous assignments available in theater. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion survived the entire period of Australian operations in spite of being targeted repeatedly by task force operations designed to destroy it through concentrated effort. First Australian Task Force noted in 1971 that D445 represented one of the most formidable forces with which the task force regularly contended, an assessment that recognized the battalion's resilience and capability in spite of years of sustained pressure that had weakened it at various times, but never eliminated it as an effective fighting force. The battalion's survival through 5 years of operations against professional Australian forces equipped with artillery, armor, aviation, and all the supporting capabilities that modern military establishments could provide testified to the limitations of firepower and tactical excellence when employed against an enemy that could disperse into population, recover in sanctuaries beyond reach of sustained operations, and regenerate through recruitment and infiltration that conventional military operations could disrupt but not prevent. Analysis of contact patterns across the 5 years revealed that Australian forces achieved favorable outcomes in roughly 9 of every 10 engagements with enemy forces, a success rate that validated tactical methods and demonstrated superior training, leadership, and combined arms coordination. Ambush operations constituted 36% of all contacts during the period, reflecting the emphasis Australian doctrine placed on intelligence-led operations that positioned forces to intercept enemy movement rather than conducting sweeps through areas hoping to encounter Viet Cong by chance. Bunker system attacks constituted 8% of total contacts, with these engagements often resulting in heavy Australian casualties when fortified positions were assaulted directly rather than bypassed or destroyed through concentrated artillery fires. Tactical lessons learned and proven effective in Phuoc Tuy Province endured far beyond the strategic failure that saw South Vietnam disappear from the map. Military institutions worldwide studied Australian operations in Vietnam as case studies in effective counterinsurgency, offering practical lessons for special operations employment. The emphasis on intelligence-led operations, where reconnaissance guided the employment of larger conventional forces, became incorporated into doctrine for special operations forces globally. The integration of small reconnaissance elements with infantry battalions, creating an intelligence operations cycle that made both more effective entered standard practice for military forces facing irregular warfare challenges. Extended patrol techniques SAS developed. Night ambush tactics they refined through years of practice, and tracking methods they adapted from Aboriginal traditions to Southeast Asian jungle conditions all became part of the professional knowledge base that special operations communities worldwide drew upon when training their own forces. American military institutions studied Australian operations during the war itself, assigning advisors to learn from 1st Australian Task Force and incorporating Australian techniques into training programs conducted at the Recondo School operated by the 5th Special Forces Group in Nha Trang, where students ranging from American soldiers and Marines to personnel from South Vietnamese, Korean, Thai, and Filipino forces learned long-range reconnaissance patrol tactics derived from Australian patrol courses that Special Air Service personnel completed before deployment. Roger Hayden, a Navy SEAL with Team 1 who spent 10 days operating with Australian SAS patrols, recalled the experience in interviews with fellow SEAL veteran Jocko Willink decades after the war ended, noting that for the entire 10 days the Australians did not speak a word and used only hand and arm signals to communicate. Hayden told Willink that he learned more about reconnaissance during those 10 days with the Australians than anywhere else in the world, including the rigorous training programs American Special Operations Forces conducted, and that their fieldcraft was so good it established standards American forces aspired to match. The reputation the Viet Cong bestowed upon the Special Air Service as Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle, endures as a professional standard that Special Operations Forces worldwide reference when discussing what small teams can accomplish through superior training, discipline, and tactical proficiency. The concept of forces that operate unseen, strike without warning, and achieve effects disproportionate to numerical strength captures an ideal that guides special operations employment in contemporary conflicts, where conventional force advantages matter less than ability to operate among populations and gather intelligence that makes larger forces effective. The specific techniques continue to evolve as technology provides new capabilities and changing tactical environments demand adaptation. But the underlying principle that stealth and precision can achieve what mass and firepower cannot in irregular warfare remains validated by the Australian experience. Academic research mapping thousands of combat incidents from the Vietnam War confirms patterns that individual participants could not perceive during operations when they lacked the broader perspective that statistical analysis provides across entire campaigns. Studies analyzing contact data verify that Australian forces achieved the 9-to-1 favorable engagement ratio that commanders claimed during the war, demonstrating that results were not simply perception or selective memory, but reflected actual performance, measurable through comprehensive analysis of documented incidents. The village ambush operations and reconnaissance patrols that Special Air Service conducted produced measurable effects on enemy capability that large-scale American search and destroy missions did not achieve, in spite of consuming far greater resources and generating far higher friendly casualty rates. Documentation provides empirical foundation for doctrinal conclusions about effective counterinsurgency that might otherwise rest solely on anecdotal evidence subject to distortions of memory and bias. Contemporary Special Operations Forces study the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam when developing capabilities for irregular warfare and counterinsurgency operations in environments where enemies operate among populations and avoid direct confrontation with superior conventional forces. The recognition that tactical excellence is necessary but insufficient, that host nation force quality matters more than foreign force capabilities, that population security requires sustained presence and indigenous capability rather than temporary foreign intervention, all derived from analysis of operations in Phuoc Tuy Province and similar campaigns where military success did not translate into strategic achievement. The fundamental problems that Australian military operations could not solve became clear when analysis moved beyond tactical results to examine why temporary control could not be sustained after foreign forces withdrew. The statistics compiled earlier told the story. Numerical superiority without effectiveness. Force strength without results. Poor leadership, corruption, lack of motivation, and reluctance to engage the enemy characterized many South Vietnamese units, whose commanders viewed their positions as opportunities for enrichment rather than obligations to serve populations they were supposed to protect. The South Vietnamese government itself lacked legitimacy among significant portions of the population, who regarded Saigon as corrupt, incompetent, and distant from the concerns of rural villagers whose experience of government came primarily through taxation, conscription, and interactions with officials more interested in extracting resources than providing services. Few Vietnamese had confidence in their own government, according to assessments compiled by Australian and American observers, who worked closely with provincial officials and witnessed dysfunction that no amount of foreign assistance could overcome when political will to reform was absent. The civic action programs that Australian forces conducted throughout the province built facilities, provided supplies, and demonstrated short-term goodwill. But these programs often were undertaken without reference to local populations until 1969. And maintenance responsibility was given to provincial government, which lacked capacity or will to sustain what foreigners had created. The improvements remained as physical structures after Australian departure: schools, clinics, wells, improved roads. But without sustained support and maintenance, they deteriorated. And without political framework that connected these improvements to legitimate government authority, they generated no lasting loyalty that would sustain security after foreign forces withdrew. The forced resettlement during base establishment, a decision that had damaged pacification from the start, exemplified the tactical strategic contradiction. Military necessity demanded security measures that undermined political objectives. The pattern repeated throughout the 5 years at various scales, with operational requirements generating actions that achieved immediate military purposes while creating political consequences that worked against broader objectives. The one-year tour policy that governed deployments meant that experienced soldiers and commanders rotated home just as they had developed knowledge that made them most effective, creating constant personnel turnover that prevented units from accumulating and retaining expertise over multiple deployment cycles, even though the Australian professional force structure avoided some of the worst effects American conscript forces experienced with similar rotation policies. The lessons the Australian Special Air Service Regiment taught in Vietnam about what small professional forces can accomplish through patient application of sound counterinsurgency principles would influence military doctrine far beyond the strategic failure that saw South Vietnam disappear from the map in April 1975, when North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive after American support ended, and South Vietnamese forces collapsed under combined weight of military pressure and political failure. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine developed through analysis of operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere incorporates principles that Australian forces applied in Phuoc Tuy Province and validated through sustained operations that achieved measurable results, even if those results proved temporary. The lessons about what small professional teams can accomplish through patient application of proven techniques, what intelligence gathering enables in terms of conventional force effectiveness, and what sustained pressure achieves that episodic large operations cannot, remain relevant to military forces facing conflicts where fundamental challenges are political rather than purely military in nature. The withdrawal from Phuoc Tuy Province in October and December 1971 marked the end of one of the more successful Allied military campaigns in the Vietnam War. when measured by tactical effectiveness and operational results achieved over sustained periods. But measurement of success depends on objectives employed and timeframes considered. 580 soldiers conducting nearly 1,200 patrols over 5 years, achieving kill ratios exceeding 30-1 while suffering only 2 combat deaths in Special Air Service. Operations showed what professional forces applying sound tactical principles could accomplish when given operational independence and clear objectives within their assigned province. The methods they developed entered permanent military knowledge and continue to influence special operations doctrine decades later across multiple nations and service branches, providing lasting legacy that extended far beyond the strategic failure that consumed South Vietnam. When political framework necessary to sustain security without foreign military presence proved impossible to establish. General Westmoreland's directive to take over Phuoc Tuy had been executed with professional competence that demonstrated what highly trained forces could achieve through application of sound counterinsurgency doctrine in a defined area where they could operate with relative independence and focus sustained effort over multiple years. The statistics compiled at the end of 5 years documented tactical success measured by favorable contact ratios. Enemy casualties inflicted, own casualties minimized, security established, and infrastructure improved. The lessons learned about intelligence-led operations, small unit tactics, population-centered approaches, and integration of reconnaissance with conventional operations entered military doctrine and influenced forces worldwide for generations after the war ended. The soldiers who served achieved remarkable things in impossible circumstances, establishing professional standards that endure and demonstrating capabilities that validated training, selection, and doctrine development efforts that had prepared them for the mission. Excellence in tactics could not compensate for strategic incoherence or absence of viable political framework at the national level. The Australian experience in Phuoc Tuy Province demonstrated with clarity that tactical excellence is necessary but never sufficient, that professional competence can dominate terrain but cannot create political legitimacy, that foreign military forces can provide temporary security but cannot build sustainable peace when the government they support lacks the capability or will to capitalize on opportunities that military operations create through sacrifice and sustained effort over years of patient application of sound principles to problems that ultimately proved beyond military solution. The province returned to Vietnamese hands when South Vietnam collapsed in April 1975. The lessons remained in military doctrine. The question of what victory means when every battle is won but the war is lost continued to haunt military establishments worldwide for decades to come.